All right. Cell potency is a cell's ability to differentiate, its potential to differentiate. So we have a few different types of potencies that we'll be talking about today. The first one is totipotent. This one can totally uh, turn into any type of cell, including a whole new organism. So they can become any cell type, and they can even form new embryos. So our zygote or morula, which is just going to be an early cluster of cells during early development, those can be used to maintain a cell line for cloning, for example. So one way that we could clone organisms is what we could do here is we could take a donor sheep, take a cell or a collection of cells from its udder, eventually grab one of those cells. What's important here is the genetic material, the nucleus. Now, simultaneously to that, we've got another sheep, and what we'll do is we're going to take the egg cell from another adult female sheep. So, another adult female. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that egg cell and we're going to fuse these two cells together. However, what we're doing is we're replacing the nucleus in the egg cell with the donor sheep's nucleus. So we're fusing them together using electric shock. And so now this cell, this new cell, which has the casing, you could say the casing of the egg cell, but the nucleus of this sheep here. Now this cell will eventually develop into an embryo, and we implant it into the uterus of a foster mother, and then it grows, it is born, and it develops into a new sheep. And that's how we got Dolly, if you've heard about Dolly, the cloned sheep. Next, we have pluripotency. So this is a type of cell that cannot differentiate into anything. It's not totipotent. It's just fairly potent. It's pluripotent. So it can give rise to all cell types except for placenta, except for a whole new organism. You're not going to be able to create a whole new organism using a pluripotent stem cell. But it can give rise to all cell types. So that could be skin cells, nerve cells, blood cells, muscle cells, liver cells, lung cells, and so on. Pluripotent stem cells can turn into almost any cell type. Now, there's two ways that we can get these types of pluripotent stem cells. One through embryonic stem cells. So we can just pluck some from the embryo, and those cells can differentiate into most cell types. So from the inner mass of a blastocyst. And what is a blastocyst? That's just going to be an early developmental hollow sphere of cells. It's like a cluster of cells, or I guess a sphere of cells. And however, those derivatives cannot give rise to a complete organism because they're pluripotent, but they can give rise to any cell type. So not a full organism, it's not totipotent, it can give rise to any cell type. Now another way we can get pluripotent stem cells is we can induce them to become stem cells, or induce them to become pluripotent. And so what we would do here is we would pluck some of our own cells, in this case we use fibroblasts or skin cells, and we expose them to a cocktail of transcription factors which could induce them to become, what they would do is they would, relieve themselves of their original identity, and then they become a pluripotent stem cell or an induced pluripotent stem cell, which can then turn into whatever cell type. So here's an example of, the blastocyst or the embryonic stem cells. We would pluck some cells from the blastocyst. Those cells can differentiate into any cell type, or we can pluck some cells from ourselves to induce pluripotency. So we got embryonic stem cells or induced pluripotent stem cells. All right, so now our last two in terms of potency is multipotent. So this is a cell that can differentiate into a few different cell types, but it's heavily limited. So hematopoietic stem cells are going to be stem cells that can only differentiate into various forms of blood cells. Mesenchymal stem cells, those are going to be a little bit different. So those can turn into like things like bone cells or cartilage cells. or muscle cells, fat cells, but not blood cells, for example. So multipotent has kind of a more narrow window of cells that they can differentiate into. Now, lastly, we have unipotent. So uni, meaning one, this can only turn into the exact cell that it was originally. It's going to maintain the same identity of cell. So this is just mitosis. The only thing that it can turn into is the same cell type of the original cell. So that is unipotency. So just to recap, we have totipotency, which can turn into a whole new organism or any cell type. Then we have pluripotency, which can turn into any cell type at all, any of the cell types. Then we have multipotency, so you have a narrower window, so things like only blood cells or only bone, cartilage, muscle cells, for example. So those would be multipotent. And then lastly, we have unipotent, which means that they're only going to be able to create or differentiate into, they're not going to differentiate, they're going to create a new cell that is exactly the same type of cell as the original cell. And some things we can do with stem cells are things like bone marrow transplantation, or we could fix spinal cord injuries by injecting the site with stem cells. A lot of different things that we're currently working on. We haven't, completely found cures to some of these things simply using stem cells, but one that's actually become pretty popular is wound healing. It's a pretty common practice to, not common practice, but it's a popularized, often talked about practice of wound healing through stem cell injections. So here's kind of a recap here. When you have a zygote, it is a totipotent stem cell. It is a cell that can turn into a whole new organism. Once that totipotent zygote starts to develop, it's going to develop into a blastocyst. If we extract some of those blastocyst cells from there, it's going to be pluripotent. Now, if that blastocyst continues to develop, and we could implant that blastocyst into the womb, we would call it an epiblast, so post-implantation, an epiblast. Those are going to be pluripotent. Early fetuses going to have pluripotent stem cells. So none of these are going to be totipotent. Only the zygote would be totipotent. And then from the adult, we could take some skin cells, some central nervous system cells, bone marrow cells, other types of cells, and again, we induce it to become pluripotent by exposing it to a cocktail of different transcription factors to cause it to shed its original identity, to become pluripotent, so it can be used to differentiate into various types of cells. Now, most of our adult stem cells are going to either be multipotent or unipotent. So, we'll have cells that can only be converted into various types of blood cells, or we'll have, some cells that could only really turn into whatever the original cell type was.